I'm going to make a motion to return to public meeting. And I can have a second, please? Mrs. Fleischer. And then we'll go to Mr. Thank you. So our meeting is called to order, and we're going to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please. Okay, and Mrs. Sugars, can we have the roll call, please?
Mrs. Stratton.
Here.
Mrs. Fleischer.
Here.
Mrs. Gallagher.
Here.
Mr. Greenbaum.
Here.
Mr. Mayor.
Here.
Dr. Rude.
Here.
Mrs. Tong.
Here.
Mrs. Winters. Here. Ms. Stern.
Here. Okay. And we will now move on to open public comment. And before we have our public comment, just like to read our statement. Cherry Hill is a community that values education, and educational topics often bring out passionate response. The Cherry Hill Board of Education supports a school climate in which our diversity is a source of strength and all are included. Respect is foundational in how we treat you, how we treat each other, and how we support our staff and administration in their essential work. Please join us in practicing the utmost respect for all. And we will go to see, there's nobody in the room. And now I will look to see if there's any hands up online. And there's only one public comment this evening. This is our only public comment period. So it looks like we have a call in 856-489, that number. It is, you're up.
Well, my name is Jeff Podowitz, and I live in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. From New Jersey Code of Ethics for School Board Members, I will hold confidential all matters pertaining to the schools, which, if disclosed, would needlessly injure individuals or the schools. In all other matters, I will provide accurate information. In numerous presentations and on the school district's website, district representatives have said and shown graphics showing that our uncapped SFR aid, not the actual aid we received, was $29 million each of the last 14 years. At SFRA District Profile, Education Law Center, and through other services I have met, other sources I have mentioned, it can be easily found that those district presentations are inaccurate. For 2 of those years, our uncapped SFR aid and the formula aid we should have received from the state was $44 million one year and $37 million another. That was uncapped aid. The formula aid we actually received was $12.7 million for each of those 2 years alone. For those 2 years alone, we deserved an additional $56 million from the state tax relief fund sent back to our community that could have easily funded the building of a new elementary school. In the Strategic Planning Committee report dated February 7, 2023, and at school board meetings, it was discussed the district's need of building additional schools. Funding provided by the state would be only $143 per square foot, which is well below the current market value of $350 a square foot. That $56 million at $350 a square foot would have paid for the construction cost of a 160,000 square foot building. Around 2 years ago, in a presentation in front of the school board, Garrison and Associates, the school board's architects, had estimated the new construction cost of Carusi Middle School would cost $475 a square foot for the building alone. So the cost of a 112,426 square foot middle school would have been approximately $60 million alone. So what is the accurate information? Is it $350 a square foot, current market value, or $475 a square foot? Which one of those 2 numbers are accurate? Please provide us with accurate information. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, nobody in the room, no other hands up. I will close public comment at this time. Now we will move on to our superintendent's comments. Do we have any superintendent's comments?
I do not this evening, Ms. Stern. Excited to hear Mr. Green's presentation. So I'll turn it back to you and we'll go right to him.
Okay, so we're moving on to our board retreat, and we are very pleased and grateful that Mr. Paul Green, our board solicitor, will be providing us with an HIB training tonight. We will end at promptly 7:30. And Mr. Green, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam President. Is everyone okay if I sit here and do this? It's just easier to keep the computer plugged in and be up there. So we're going to do the wonderful world of HIB. Let's get started. So just talking about our board policy, we're talking, of course, about the Anti-Bullying Bill of Rights Act. Your policy essentially tracks the language of the statute where we say that the board prohibits acts of harassment, intimidation, or bullying, that a safe and civil environment is necessary for students to learn and achieve high academic standards. HIB is conduct that disrupts both the student's ability to learn and a school's ability to educate its students in a safe and disciplined environment. We have the toughest anti-bullying law in the United States. It's a zero tolerance approach to HIB. The purpose of the law is prevention, not reaction. Its key is to try to stop HIB in its tracks as much as possible. We're often dealing with cases of multiple aggressors and multiple victims. It's not always easy to identify when something is HIB, which would trigger the investigation protocol. As we've seen, we often struggle with that. We often actually debate among it between board members and administrators. And I've often had very lengthy discussions in terms of dealing with that. We deal with off-campus conduct as well as on-campus conduct. And a significant amount of administrative time and resources are monopolized by the law, which is not a bad thing. It's just a reality that there's a tremendous amount of time and effort that goes into that, which we always need to be aware of. So just some statistics from 2018-19, which is the last year of statistics we have before the pandemic, and is also one of the base years because 17-18 and 18-19 is when the state changed the reporting system, and basically the standards that are being used statistically really derive from that particular period of time. So it's hard to compare those years to prior years. So these are our base years. In 18-19, there were 16,952 investigations. 17-18, there were over 18,000. 7,183 were confirmed HIB, or 42%. Student offenders, this is a great surprise, in grades 5 through 8 were responsible for the majority of HIB offenses, 51%. And then the effect of HIBs, 82% it was the effect was insulted or demeaned students, 51% knew would cause harm, 45% was a hostile environment, 41% interfered with education, 34% the victim in fear. The types of HIB endured far and away were verbal, and that continues to be the case, followed by written, and then the others are trailing behind. The targets, the great majority was other distinguishing characteristics, 4,063. That continues to be the case. It was 6,700 in 17-18, and we'll see continues to be the case now. Followed by race as the next category, religion and ancestry origin and sexual orientation. Actually, sexual orientation and gender tended to be the next category in terms of the targets. Incident location, 80% were on school grounds, 11% off school grounds, 9% both on and off school grounds. That continues to be similar in 1920, which is the last year we have the report for. The commissioner's 1920 report shows similar numbers. The bulk were verbal, followed by physical, electronic, gesture, and written. In 1920, according to the report, again, the far and away effect was insulted or demeaned the student. The least category was victim in fear. The disciplinary actions that districts imposed were suspensions in 2,419 confirmed cases. Other discipline was 1,742. The remedial actions, which is again a key component of HIB in 1920, you can see far and away was student counseling, followed by parent conferences, and then other approaches, which could be a lot of different things. We don't know exactly what they are. Interestingly, restorative practices are far behind the other category. So that is broken out as a separate area, as not part of the other. The nature of the investigations, these bar graphs kind of show you visually, again, that other was the far and away the other distinguishing characteristic, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Many of the 3,500 were no identified natures, so they were, of course, not HIBs. Then followed by race, gender, and sexual orientation are very close in terms of the numbers. Disability then comes next. Ancestry and religion is the least number of cases reported. The nature of the bullying incident, again, other far and away is the highest category. And then you can see there following the other categories. So, yes. Sure.
For clarification, this is statewide data.
This is statewide data. These are all school districts in the state.
Commissioner, okay.
Right. This is the Commissioner of Education's report
Thank you.
summarizing the data that we all have to provide, all the school districts have to provide to the Department of Education. So you're looking at statewide numbers here. I would say that they probably compare pretty closely to what we see statistically. Let's talk a little bit about the definition of HIB, because it's always a good idea to start at the beginning in terms of what are we talking about. This is a statute that basically is derived from the employment discrimination statutes, Title VII, has a lot of its roots in the sexual harassment body of law. So as we know, it's clearly not what one traditionally thinks of as bullying, typically because it's a very technical definition. And it must meet a number of parameters. The first is what? Any gesture, any written, verbal, or physical act, or any electronic communication. You start with that. There has to be some action of some sort. Then we follow with how often. It can be a single incident or a series of incidents. What is it perceived as? Perceived as motivated by what? It has to be reasonably perceived. And that's a key word, reasonably perceived. It's a theoretical, objective, reasonable person in that position as being motivated either by any actual or perceived characteristic. So what are the characteristics? Well, the statute has a number of references: race, color, religion, ancestry, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, or mental, physical, or sensory disability. Many of these come from the civil rights statutes, including the New Jersey Law Against Discrimination, which actually has a broader section of illustrations, but these are part of what's contained in there. And then we have the catch-all, or by any other distinguishing characteristic, which often becomes the interesting discussion of what is that? What's a distinguishing characteristic? We'll come back to that. Where or when, where and when. That takes place on school property, at any school-sponsored function, or on a school bus or off school grounds, essentially anywhere. That does what? Okay, now comes the what. Because you meet these prongs, it also has to substantially disrupt or interfere with the orderly operation of the school or the rights of other students, and must then meet one of the three additional criteria. So you must meet all these prongs first. Once you meet these prongs, you now have to find that it meets one of these three criteria. A reasonable person should know under the circumstances it will have the effect of physically or emotionally harming a student or damaging the student's property, or placing a student in reasonable fear of physical or emotional harm. Or, if you don't meet the first one, B has the effect of insulting or demeaning any student or group of students, and oftentimes this will be the key factor that's found in an HIB, or creates a hostile educational environment for the student by interfering with the student's education or severely or pervasively causing physical or emotional harm. So distinguishing characteristics, as we saw, there are 9 specific categories in the law. Then there's the other distinguishing characteristic, which is very broad. It can be vegetarianism, it can be head lice, it could be the quiet kid oftentimes. There are a number of factors that could come into play, but there must be some evidence to support a conclusion regarding an other characteristic. So you have to have something that supports the determination that there's in other characteristic. You can't just say there's a general other distinguishing characteristic. You have to identify what that is. So how do we know if it meets the test for a distinguishing characteristic? There's a number of cases that have talked about this over the years. CC versus the Montgomery Board of Education. That's the one where comments that vegetarians are stupid. Eating meat gives you a smarter and bigger brain. That dealt with eating habits, and being a vegetarian can be a distinguishing characteristic. SC versus Jefferson Board of Education, that the students sucked at basketball, was short and would not go to college. Distinguishing characteristics motivated by a perception of targeted sports proficiency, height, and intelligence. WCL and Tenafly, there was a single comment. It was true the student had dyed her hair because she had head lice. That was found to be HIB. That essentially it was the characteristic of having had the infection of the head lice and result of dyeing her hair. JMC, single incident where a male student was told he danced like a girl, was found to be an HIB violation. Bullying based on sex and gender roles. So distinguishing characteristics can be very broad. In RGB versus Ridgewood, a student was called fat ass, and horse. Significantly, the student was not overweight. And in that case, that didn't matter. The incident of HIB was based on the student's body image, and it affected the student. So the fact that she was objectively not overweight really didn't, at the end of the day, get the offender off, because it was based on the student's body image, and it did have an impact. Substantial disruption, although the word substantial is used, only one student needs to be impacted. It can be dramatic, but it can also be much more subtle. It can be a change in demeanor, increased fear or anxiety, impact on attendance at school, a number of factors. It does not have to be overly dramatic in terms of the impact, but it has to be more than a momentary annoyance. So there have been cases where students said, it really didn't bother me, and there was no disruption found because there was really no impact on the student at all. Cyberbullying is another area that we have to deal with. Bullying often occurs electronically or via email, text, Snapchat, all kinds of potential media. We have the right, and in fact, we have the obligation to investigate cyberbullying claims. We can discipline students for that, but only where it is reasonably necessary for physical or emotional safety and well-being, or for reasons relating to the safety, security, and well-being of other students, staff, or school grounds. Typically, the conduct has to materially and substantially interfere with the requirements of appropriate discipline. That is the standard for any discipline that we impose for any off-campus conduct. We do have a right to discipline for off-campus conduct, but typically we can only do it only where there's a material and substantial interference with appropriate discipline. So there has to be some nexus or spillover into the school before the board can act on that particular area. Immunity under the law: a member of a board of education or school employee who promptly reports an incident and makes the report in compliance with the procedures is immune from a cause of action. So everyone here is basically immunized for making a proper report, which means that somebody can't come after a board member or an employee later and say, you made a false report that essentially maligned my child and caused my child, emotional damage. That is absolutely not permitted under the law. That action cannot be brought. A school administrator who receives a report and fails to initiate an investigation, or should have known of an incident and fails to take sufficient action, may be subject to disciplinary action. There is a nexus with criminal conduct. The Anti-Bullying Act does not criminalize HIB. It's not a criminal statute, but behavior that may be considered HIB may also be an independent criminal offense. Some of those can include bias, intimidation, hazing, harassment, cyber harassment included, assault, threats, or sexual offenses. So there may be a situation where we're dealing with both HIB and criminal conduct. That may happen. In that case, we have to coordinate the investigations with law enforcement. We do not have to report HIB investigations to law enforcement unless that it's clear that the conduct also is a criminal offense. At that point, if we report it, if both law enforcement and school officials are investigating, we will typically be asked by law enforcement to suspend our investigation. We will suspend it only if they do request us to do that. It's very rare that they don't, because their investigation takes priority. That should be memorialized. There should always be, an email is sufficient, but there should be a request in writing. And the parents and guardians of both the perpetrator and victim alleged should be advised of that. Typically, that's not an objection from the parents, but if a parent does object, law enforcement actually has to get a formal court order, technically compelling the delay of the investigation. So we would have to coordinate with the police on that and with the municipality. Once the law enforcement investigation is complete, we may resume our investigation. We have a legal reporting obligation. Anyone, not just board members and administrators, but anyone who has witnessed or has reliable information that a student has been subjected to HIB must report the incident to the anti-bullying specialist, any school administrator or SRO, and then we immediately initiate the procedures. The standards and procedures: all acts of HIB must be reported verbally to the school principal on the same day when the school employee witnessed or received reliable information. Obviously, that doesn't apply to a pupil coming forward. There's nothing that says a pupil must or a parent must report something, immediately to the principal, but it does apply to our employees. The principal must inform the parents or guardians of all students involved in the alleged incident and may discuss as appropriate the availability of counseling and other intervention services. All acts of HIB must be reported in writing within 2 school days of when the employee or contracted service provider, because if we have a contracted service provider, they're under the same obligation, witnessed or received reliable information of the HIB. The investigation must be initiated by the principal or the designee, which is typically the anti-bullying specialist, within 1 school day of the report of the incident. So you don't necessarily wait for the written report. It's basically conducted by the ABS, unless there's a pre-assessment, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that it's not HIB. Principal has the right to appoint additional personnel if necessary to assist in the investigation. If it's an employee matter, it's not done by the ABS, but it's done by an administrator because of the conflict of interest of having the ABS investigate a fellow employee. Some of what we recommend to the investigators: this is the advice that we provide to the anti-bullying specialists. 1 is most important: know your policy and follow the timelines. Make sure you have a clear understanding of the complaint. Know the students involved in their history, if any. Consider speaking with teachers or administrators. Determine if this is a pattern, which is very important. Age of the parties involved will affect, obviously, how the investigation is conducted. Does law enforcement need to be contacted? If the case is complicated, consider having a second investigator assist. Interviews should be conducted in a private location. Begin with an opening statement. The investigator should explain who the investigator is, what the goal is, and what is expected of the person being interviewed. Keep very detailed notes of interview questions and responses. Consider having somebody present to take notes. Begin with the person who brought the complaint to your attention. Then you next interview the victim, interview the witnesses. The last person who's interviewed is the alleged offender. Ask interviewers to follow up if they have additional information, and remind interviewees that there shall be no retaliation against anyone involved in the matter. The investigator should review their interview notes, re-review the policy if necessary, determine whether follow-up interviews are needed, determine whether certain documentation needs to be gathered, assess credibility, which is the most important part of the investigation to a large extent, is determining who's credible and who perhaps is less credible, and prepare your report. Standards and procedures: the investigation must be completed as soon as possible, but no later than 10 school days from the date of the written report. If there's information relative to the investigation that's anticipated but not yet received, then the report may be amended later to reflect the information after it's determined. And that sometimes may happen even after the board has actually gotten the results of the investigation. The results of the investigation shall be reported to the superintendent within 2 school days of the completion. And then the superintendent may decide to provide intervention services, training programs to reduce HIB, impose discipline, order counseling, or take other action. So some of the factors that are basically involved: age, developmental and maturity levels of the parties involved, degrees of harm, surrounding circumstances, nature and severity of the behavior, past or continuing patterns of behavior, relationship between the parties involved, and the context in which the alleged incidents occurred. Some of this may also be, for example, if we're dealing with a student with an educational disability, that will also factor into that first bullet point, because it may be that while the student technically committed an act of HIB, because as we'll talk about, intent is really not relevant. It's the reasonable perception. So an act may actually be HIB, even though the student could not form the intent to perform the act. And there you need to basically take into account that particular student's disability in determining the consequences and how you're going to deal with it. Or if you're dealing with a victim, it may also impact in terms of the kind of counseling that you may be providing to the student. So that becomes an important factor in terms of dealing with the particular consequences and how you deal with the case itself. The report has to be made to the Board of Education no later than the board meeting which follows the completion of the investigation. That report has to include information on any services provided, training established, or discipline imposed, or other action taken or recommended by the superintendent. One of the areas we'll be looking into is whether the program we're using can support the type of information that we should be getting in terms of the nature of the report that's being provided. Report to parents within 5 school days after the results are reported to the board. The parents or guardians are entitled to receive information, including the nature, whether the district found evidence, whether discipline was imposed, and or services provided. There's a little interplay here in terms of student confidentiality. So there are limits on how we provide that information, but we do provide that basic parameter of information to the parents. Parents may request a hearing before the board after receiving the information. The hearing shall be held within 10 business days of the request. On very many occasions, the parents are willing to extend that somewhat if necessary, to have a little additional time for the hearing. Any request by the parents for a hearing before the district board. Originally, the statute had no time limit on this. It was subsequently amended to provide that parents must file a request for an appeal within 60 calendar days after they receive the written information about the board's receipt of the report. The theory when the statute was adopted, I believe, was that the parents would have time to basically have an appeal heard before the board actually voted on the report. It's not really typically worked out that way. In most districts, as in Cherry Hill, what typically happens is that by the time the parents request the hearing, which they have 60 days to do, the board has already voted. And at that point, the board is essentially reconsidering the prior vote that it already adopted. So at the next meeting following its receipt of the report, the board must issue a decision in writing to affirm, reject, or modify the superintendent's decision as relayed to the board. And then that decision may be appealed to the Commissioner of Education. 2 times each school year, between September 1 and January 1, and between January 1 and June 30th at a public meeting, the superintendent must report to the board all acts of violence, vandalism, and harassment, intimidation, or bullying which occurred during the previous reporting period. Each of our schools is graded. We do self-assessments that are used to grade each school for the purposes of assessing our effort, and those are publicized. The district website contains that information for the current school year. We have a variety of things that have to be and are on our website. We have to have the policy or link to the policy, the grade for each school, a link to the HIB report, and the names and contact info for the anti-bullying specialists and our anti-bullying coordinator. We have to annually examine training needs of school employees and volunteers who have significant contact with students. And we must annually conduct a reevaluation, reassessment, and review of our HIB policy. I'm actually kind of summarizing here. There's a fairly more extensive list of the requirements for us in the regulation and in the statute. I've also, because of time constraints, left out references in here to the school climate and safety committees, which could be the subject of an entirely separate presentation. I'm here trying to focus mainly on the key provisions of the statute itself. So some of the provisions that were adopted under what's known as Mallory's Law, which was signed into law in January of 2022 and went into effect, except for the cyber harassment component, on July 1st of 2022, named for a student, an 8th grade student who unfortunately committed suicide in Rockaway Township after having been bullied. So where our policy permits a preliminary determination, which Cherry Hills does, to be made regarding whether an incident falls outside of the scope of HIB, then the superintendent must annually provide to the board information on the number of times that a preliminary determination was made that it was outside the scope. So in essence, our principals can do a pre-assessment and determine that a matter is clearly not HIB, but code of conduct, that it has, for instance, there is absolutely no distinguishing characteristic. There's nothing that ties it into the HIB law. Typically, oftentimes that will be somebody may file a complaint over something that's mutual conflict where students are in a fight or engaging in back and forth. And it's not really meeting the definition. The principal can essentially send that down the code of conduct line and not initiate an HIB investigation, but then has to report that to the superintendent. The superintendent may then require the principal to conduct an investigation if the superintendent determines that it's necessary, because in the superintendent's opinion, it is potentially within the scope. The 10-day timeline starts from the time the superintendent makes that decision. So once the superintendent makes that determination, then the 10-day clock starts running. HIB policies already had to include consequences and appropriate remedial action. The new legislation also includes that we have to have a specific list of potential consequences. They may include, for the first act of HIB, a copy shall be placed in the student's record. Does not necessarily mean it's in the student's cumulative file, but there has to be a student record that contains the information somewhere. The student may be subject to remedial actions, including counseling, behavioral intervention services, or discipline, or both. For a second act, very similar, again, essentially repeats the first act. And then for the third act and each subsequent act, and the question has come up, is this, are we talking about one school year or forever over the student's career? The legislation does not put any parameters on that. The Department of Education has advised that this is per school year. So it's the number of incidents per year that governs it. For the third and each subsequent act, that triggers a higher level of response. We put the results in the record. We again develop, and now we develop an individual student intervention plan, which must be approved by the superintendent or designee, and may include remedial actions, including counseling or behavioral intervention services, progressive discipline, and may require the student accompanied by a parent or guardian to complete in a satisfactory manner a class or training program to reduce harassment, intimidation, or bullying behavior. Question comes up, how do we compel a parent or guardian to do that? In that kind of a situation, if necessary, if the parent is actually being essentially willfully non-compliant or refusing to comply, then we would contact Child Protective Services and DCP&P and essentially bring the county social services agencies into the picture to try and persuade the parent to get involved. Superintendent or designee and the principal must consult law enforcement as appropriate. We have a uniform memorandum of agreement, which is provided by the Attorney General. Every district in the state signs off on that with its local police department. And that has provisions in it that talk about when and how we report particular potential criminal issues to law enforcement. There is also a prior obligation that pre-existed, still exists, where we have reason to believe a bias-related act has been or is about to be committed. Our policies already had to include language that the principal would inform the parents or guardians and may discuss as appropriate the availability of counseling. Mallory's law modifies that, includes the following, which must be in our policies. The principal shall keep a written record of the date, time, and manner of notification to the parents or guardians. So that must be maintained in a written record to show that required communication actually occurred. The report from a staff member contracted service provider is a number of form which has been developed by the Department of Education. Statute said to be developed, that now exists. Form must be completed even if a preliminary determination is made that it's outside the scope of HIB. We still must complete the form and keep it on file. It is not included in any student record unless there's disciplinary action or we have some other reason to have to keep it. The district must provide a means for parents to complete an online numbered form as well. That form is available for online submission and can be anonymously reported. And then the statute says the superintendent may provide different actions, establish different programs or interventions, gives the superintendent the option of seeking further information after receiving the results of the investigation. which is really nothing different from what we've been doing all along. It's just that the statute explicitly provides that the superintendent has that right. A redacted copy of the form removing all student identification information must be confidentially shared with the board after the investigation concludes, if a hearing is requested by the parents. So that for every hearing that really should be shared with the board. On our homepage, we post the current version of the document guidance for parents on the Anti-Bullying Bill of Rights, which is on the Department of Ed's website. It also establishes the new position of school climate state coordinator in the NJDOE, who in theory is going to be there to help provide districts with information in terms of implementing the HIB statute and with addressing HIB in the schools. There is another component in the law for cyber harassment. This was badly needed. It basically creates an option for a municipal court to order a minor under the age of 16 and the parent or guardian to attend training to reduce the tendency towards such behavior or raise awareness of dangers of cyber harassment. So that provides a tool for the municipal court to get involved. Parent may be fined for failing to comply with the court order. And if the parent willfully or wantonly fails to exercise duty, which is a fairly high standard, can be actually liable in a civil action for a suit. So let's talk about some of the recent case law. Key case is Webber versus Verona Township Board of Education. And by the way, if people want to ask questions, or engage in dialogue, feel free. Yeah, you want to pause right here? Yeah, because we just covered a lot in a very short amount of time. I'm covering a lot of stuff in a short amount of time.
Appreciate
Yeah.
it. You want to put your microphone on? That's okay. We can hear you.
So I have 3 questions. So the first is when I forget the anti-bullying, the representative who's doing
The anti-bullying specialist.
yeah, who's doing the investigation. Are parents allowed to be present
No.
during? No.
Parents, well, they do not have a right to be present, and typically we do not allow them to be present because they can actually affect the interview.
Okay.
Yeah.
If there's a criminal investigation happening and the HIB investigation is put on hold, how do you ensure that the potential victim is not then, if that the situation doesn't continue to happen during?
You have to be very,
Right.
very good question. The administration needs to be very sensitive to that. They need to, first of all, they need to have everybody watching out as much as possible. But you also have to tell the victim, look, you need to come forward if you continue to have problems, because we need to know that. Oftentimes they'll speak to the parents about it as well. Just say, look, let us know, keep us in the loop if because these kids are very crafty. They'll do things when no adult is around or nobody can hear or see it. So that the parents and the student need to know that they need to come forward, and certainly should come forward if there continues to be issues.
Okay.
In terms of that.
And then my last question is, if a student if like a HIB is founded and the school has determined that the offender needs behavioral intervention, whose cost is that?
Well, typically that would be the parent's cost.
Okay.
In terms of that, there might be circumstances especially if it's a special ed situation, where that might become part of an IEP, for example, or a 504 plan in a particular context. So there might be times when it would be the district's, but typically that'll be the parent's obligation.
All right, thank you.
Jen.
Thanks, Paul. I'm appreciating how fast you're going too, but I did have a question. It was actually slide 40, the report to the Board of Education. It says the results shall be reported to the board no later than the board meeting which follows the completion of the investigation, along with information on any services provided, training established, or discipline imposed.
Mhm. That's
always been a sticking point with us because we have never been told like what has happened to the person who had the HIB, as the offender. So I didn't know if, I'm just sort of putting it out there. That's always been a question that we ask every
Right.
meeting.
Yeah, and what we're going to have to look into is the capability of the program itself to include that information. Yeah, that's what I was
That's what
talking
you're
about in
talking
terms,
about?
right?
Got it.
That type of information. And there's always a question of, how far into the weeds do you get, or how far down do you drill? Because we're always careful about student confidentiality as well. And the question is what's the extent of the board's involvement or role here? But there does need to be some basic reporting that this report format needs to include.
It's good that you say that, because actually to loop it back around, like what Ben said, it was like he was talking about the commissioner is the report that we had,
Mhm.
but then they told us all the different ways that it had been handled, like peer groups and that type of stuff, things that I don't believe any of us have ever been exposed to or given those options, that that's what the kids could have gone into.
Mhm.
So those two things I think are directly related into
Yes.
like my question with that.
Right.
And then my last question is, and Joe, it might be more for you or Dr. Malash, because I know we've done this before, but I didn't know if there were set times, because it has the annual report and public hearing the 2 times a year between September 1st and January 1st and January 1st and June 30th, that the public hearing, the superintendent shall report forward all acts of violence, vandalism, harassment, and HIBs that occur. And I know we've at least had one, but are there set times that we have that each year?
So typically we have one in early November, either late October, or early November, but typically early November because we often only have one board meeting in October. And then the second time will either be in April or May. I haven't talked to Mr. Saporito yet to find out when he's going to do that.
Thank you. I knew that we had them, but I just wasn't sure when to look forward to that. So thank you very much. That's it. Thank you.
So just to follow up, I mean, I've made a, thank you for pointing those things out, and I've made a couple notes about, wanting to make sure that we're on track with obviously how this is supposed to be implemented. The other piece is ensuring that we do always get a redacted copy of the form when there's a hearing.
When there's a hearing.
Yeah, there's just a few things that I want to make sure we're on track for,
Right.
that we haven't been always thus far. So I'm hoping we can
Yes.
get on track by.
Right.
I mean, listen, even if I recognize there's a heavy lift with doing these, and we see that that doesn't preclude us from the responsibility to be compliant, even if the software is not great.
Well, this part you don't need the software for, because this is the report form itself.
Right,
So
but
that, yeah, and
the other
but
piece
the other
that- that
piece.
Jen
if-
raised,
Well,
yeah.
my point is, if the software is not compliant, somehow we need to figure out a way
Yeah.
to deal with that.
Yeah, I think that's important, because I think that's something that we're all becoming more aware of, that we want to be on track with.
Ready to move on? So WEBA 2020 case for Verona Township Board of Education. Teacher met with a student to discuss desire to enroll in an AP course, recommended to the student not to enroll in the course because of its difficulty. In the teacher's opinion, the student was having trouble in the current honors course. Student had anxiety and panic disorders and a 504 plan. They filed an HIB complaint alleging the teacher made verbal remarks about the student's ability to handle the requirements of the AP course, and that the remarks touched upon the student's disability. These fact patterns, I mean, have occurred in pretty much every district I've been in at one point or another. The district determined that the teacher unintentionally bullied the student when she made demeaning comments in the classroom. The teacher appealed to the Commissioner of Education. The commissioner affirmed the district's decision. An act of HIB, this is the important point, can be unintentionally committed. The teacher had no intention to bully the student or to intimidate the student. But the question that's always asked is, how was the action perceived by the victim? And was that perception reasonable, rather than what the alleged bullies or offenders' actual motivation was? So that's a key principle, is that this is really not an intention statute. You can unintentionally commit an act of HIB without ever having really meant to do so. Very key point. CS versus Lacey. 11th grade student was singing a solo in a music class. The CH complained that classmate JS plugged her ears, made gestures, and made a comment about needing earplugs. Claimed that she was sensitive to loud noises and that she should be singing loudly, which is why she plugged her ears, denied making the comment. 2 students had previously been involved in a romantic relationship. The district determined that JS committed an act of HIB, targeted CH, who she viewed as a weaker and emotionally vulnerable female, having a perception of a characteristic relating to sexual orientation. Thus, there were 2 potential distinguishing characteristics. One was the perceived sexual orientation, and 2, that she was a weaker and more vulnerable female. On appeal, the district's determination was reversed. Commissioner found that the alleged conduct appears, and this again goes to show you that, board can reach one conclusion and maybe it was not a unanimous conclusion. And the commissioner might not agree. Although the commissioners will see has to have a really strong basis for reversing a board. The alleged conduct appears to stem from the student's past relationship and was not motivated by an actual or perceived distinguishing characteristic. So the commissioner found that there was no distinguishing characteristic here that could really be reasonably perceived. That it dealt strictly from the past relationship. Now one could differ with that perhaps, but that was the commissioner's determination. But the bottom line is that demeaning or harmful conduct in and of itself is not sufficient to form a basis for HIB where there's no distinguishing characteristic. I think one could debate whether or not the commissioner was right to state there was none, but that was the commissioner's determination in that particular case. JP versus Gloucester County called his classmate gay, which he admitted doing, but argued he used the term in a joking manner. How many of these have we heard? And did not mean for it to be demeaning. District determined that he did commit an act of HIB. The actual or perceived characteristic that motivated the act was perceived sexual orientation. Commissioner upheld the board's decision. Said it did not matter whether DP intended, again, intention is not relevant, to demean AG or not. A board can find that an individual committed an act of HIB even if the individual did not intend to cause harm. Commenting on or misstating, because it can be perceived characteristic, or even misstating some characteristic, even though you know it's not true. Another student's sexual orientation could reasonably be perceived as being motivated by that characteristic. The comments in that particular case substantially disrupted the student's education, and the comments were insulting or demeaning. I guess one could debate whether calling someone gay is really insulting or demeaning, since many people are proud to be gay, frankly, but in that particular case, they found it was. JB versus Northern Valley Regional. The student's mother alleged her son was bullied. How many of these have we heard? Ostracized and singled out by the varsity soccer coach because of his bad behavior and commitment to academics. The district determined that the coach did not commit any acts of HIB. There was no evidence of any distinguishing characteristics serving as motivation. The commissioner upheld the board's determination. There was no evidence that Truppy, the coach, targeted the student for his academic commitment. Commissioner did note the questionable treatment of the players, but found that he was essentially an equal opportunity offender. It was largely universal. He was essentially miserable to all the players. And clearly, one of the key factors here, status as a student alone is not sufficient to substantiate a finding of HIB. Being a student is not a distinguishing characteristic. WH versus Beverly City Board of Education. The fifth grade student's mother complained that students in her class were upset and calling him names. They did not like him because his absences caused them to lose an attendance contest and not have a pizza party. District open investigation found it did not constitute HIB. Commissioner found that there was no evidence that the student was targeted due to any distinguishing characteristic. Rather, evidence showed that the incident regarded it was a conflict between students. And the key issue with conflict is it tends to be mutual. It tends to be back and forth rather than directed, particularly at one particular student. In this case, the commissioner found it was conflict and not HIB. However, the commissioner was careful to point out, although it did not amount to an act of HIB, the board should take steps to ensure that its code of conduct policy is enforced. And this is something we always do because we need to keep in mind that even if something's not HIB, typically if it's coming to this level, there is a code of conduct violation that's also tied into it. And that's how we will deal with the matter, as a violation of the code of conduct. And it still will be addressed. It's just not going to be addressed in the format of an HIB. And all students should be encouraged to interact with each other in a more positive manner. So there was a little dig in a way by the commissioner saying, hey, you guys really need to take a little more attention to following up on this from that angle. JC versus Ramapo Indian Hills. High school freshman removed the pants of a student while another student held the student down. There was a photograph that was taken during the incident and distributed. The alleged actor or offender also removed his own pants. Parents complained to the school that due to this incident, other students were threatening the victim and calling him names. So rather, the offender's parents complained that the parents of the victim filed an HIB complaint. District concluded that it was an act of HIB because he committed a physical act reasonably perceived motivated by the gender, substantially disrupted or interfered with the orderly operation of the school, and that would have the effect of physically or emotionally harming. The victim underwent counseling as a result of the incident. The parents appealed the HIB determination, and the commissioner upheld the board's decision, finding sufficient credible evidence to support the board's determination that the offender removed the pants and exposed the victim's buttocks while he was held down, and removed his own pants. Commissioner said, very importantly here, while the evidence may leave room for two opinions, you could have a reasonably divergent opinion on this, that in itself is not sufficient to overturn the board's decision, as it does not demonstrate that the decision was arbitrary, capricious, or unreasonable. When a parent appeals an HIB determination by the board, that is the standard that the parent has to meet. It's a very high standard to meet. Basically, they have to show that we had no reasonable basis to determine in that particular case that it was or was not HIB. And the commissioner said to overturn the board's decision would require the commissioner to substitute his judgment for the board's, and the commissioner does not have the legal ability to do that. That basically the board's determination has to stand unless there is some basis to determine that there is no reason that it can be sustained, essentially. WD versus Jefferson, a fifth grade student called another student the N-word. This was one incident of the use of the word. It was part of inappropriate banter, both online and on a school bus, going back and forth between a group of these students. The anti-bullying specialist concluded it was a conflict. It was a group of fifth grade students using vulgar language and pretending to fight, and not an act of HIB. The victim was upset by the word, but there was a finding that there was no substantial disruption or interference with the student's rights or the academic program. Now, there are other cases that have held that a victim being upset is sufficiently disruptive. So, but here I think the key was that it was a lot of really bad language back and forth between a bunch of fifth grade girls. And so I think they basically were focusing more on the fact that it was conflict and a lot of really nasty words were being flung back and forth. This was upheld. This is basically a court decision. If we were to adopt the petitioner's position that the single use of a racial slur is a per se violation of the act, we would effectively legislate and give new meaning to the plain language of the act. So this goes to show that these cases are very, very fact specific, very fact intensive. There will be times when the single use of the N-word will be HIB, and there may be certain circumstances where it will not automatically be held to be a violation. Essentially, what the court's saying is you need to analyze all of the factors under the statute. You can't just say by using the word one time you violated the statute. LK versus Mansfield Township. So student AK repeatedly questioned NV and made comments about his name, his hair, and his clothing based on the student's gender identity and expression. Continued despite warnings from the staff to stop. Took place on the school bus and school grounds. The board found it was HIB. Commissioner upheld the board's decision. Now here we're talking about a 7-year-old. So the commissioner said, I'm mindful that child was only 7 years old at the time of the incidents. Nonetheless, she should have known that her persistent conduct was causing emotional harm to the student, given that she was repeatedly counseled that her behavior was not appropriate. So a situation where the student, even though she was young, had been repeatedly told this was harmful, it was causing harm, and that she needed to stop. She continued to persist in the behavior, and it was found to be HIB. MS versus Hainesport. HIB complaint alleging that the student slammed the other student's laptop, pulled on his earbuds, called him a weakling, saying, your athletic ability, you suck. The district found the actions did constitute HIB because it was motivated by distinguishing characteristics. We mentioned this briefly earlier on, being weak and bad at sports, disrupted or interfered with orderly operation of the schools and caused the student to feel embarrassed. Commissioner upheld the board's decision, again noting that there's a very high standard of review based on deference. It doesn't really matter, the commissioner says, whether I have a different opinion. The real challenge is that I have to give deference to the board's good faith determination unless there's really absolutely no basis to uphold the board's decision. It was reasonable for the board here to conclude on the evidence presented that the distinguishing characteristic was being weak, and the causing him a weakling was motivated by that characteristic. It was not unreasonable for the board to find that JM was embarrassed by the comment. KP versus Saddlebrook. This one, the parent filed an HIB complaint. Another student said her daughter was ugly and a bad dancer. The board declined to conduct. They made a preliminary assessment that even if true, this would not meet the definition of HIB. Commissioner agreed that the board was not arbitrary, capricious, or unreasonable. There was no allegation by the petitioner that the alleged victim had a distinguishing characteristic. There was nothing unusual about the child's appearance. She was not ugly. Or that the comments regarding her dancer were in any way motivated by a distinguishing characteristic. So the bottom line is calling someone a bad dancer is not HIB. Yes, the ugly part.
Yeah, I mean, we earlier looked at a case or we in the presentation talked about that even if you're called fat, right? I think
Yeah,
that was the word.
That
and
was,
then-
and it's
and
very
then-
interesting, right? Yeah.
And then it affects body image. Well, ugly affects body image too,
It can,
even
yeah.
if even
There
if
was,
the
in this case,
child
there was
isn't
no,
fat.
right, but well, this case, there was, in the prior case, there was a finding that it did affect the child. The child had a body image issue that did affect her. But you're right. I mean, you look at this and I don't know that I would have made a preliminary determination that it's not HIB. Personally, if I got asked this question, I would say put it through as an HIB. You may investigate it. You may reach that conclusion later, but I would not make a preliminary determination that it was not. I agree with you. I mean, I think it
Yeah,
raises that question. Yeah.
I
And this goes to show you how these cases can, you can have very similar facts and they can go two different ways a lot of times.
Well, I also think in our role of determining and supporting decisions, which, generally we're basing a lot of that on the investigation done by the staff and the staff's recommendations. A sensitivity of body image in a young child might not even be well developed. A sense of how that a child may not be in tune with their own internal response. There may be shame, I just think about how do you determine one word versus another does not definitively affect, it just
It's not
seems
easy.
like
It's, well, this
it
shows
seems
you
a
why.
bit arbitrary,
Well,
quite honestly.
it potentially can be. That's why these are so factually intensive, among other things. If you have a situation where there's, the key thing here is that in that particular case, the petitioners really never really made an allegation of any distinguishing characteristic. And there was apparently no impact as well. Not quite mentioned here. So it's an interesting question. Yeah. That a bad dancer, I would agree, is not HIB. Ugly is that's why I put it in. It raises the interesting question. Right.
Not at all.
Right.
Factual statement.
So here's a case where a board's decision was found arbitrary and capricious for a very critical reason. So, and it's interesting because this talks about an area where I've frankly been of the opinion that one's haircut is not a distinguishing characteristic, but in this particular case, they found this the other way. So a student alleged engaged in HIB when he told a fellow sixth grader who just got a haircut that he looked like Donald Trump. The ALJ found in favor of the school district. The commissioner reversed. And so again, now the ALJ is an administrative law judge. So this case went to the Office of Administrative Law for a full hearing with witnesses. The administrative law judge upheld the district's determination. The commissioner reversed and remanded. He said, he disagreed with the determination. The ALJ then dismissed the case on procedural grounds, said that the parent had abandoned the appeal. The commissioner reversed that and said the parent didn't abandon the appeal, make a decision. So then the ALJ recommended dismissal of the petition, finding in favor of the board that all the elements required to establish HIB were established, that the board's actions were not arbitrary, capricious, or unreasonable. Commissioner disagreed. The commissioner found there was no documentation in the report or the principal's letter addressing whether the conduct substantially disrupted or interfered with the rights of other students or the orderly operation of the school, which, as we've seen, is one of the key elements of the statute. So in this case, two witnesses testified that the alleged victim shaved his head and felt reluctant to return to school. There was no mention of that in the HIB report, nor was there any evidence to support that information. Any evidence to support that information was presented to the board before it acted. So the board couldn't even show that it even knew that this evidence existed. So the commissioner found the action was arbitrary, capricious, and unreasonable because there was no evidence that the board considered all of the factors required to prove an element of HIB. So it's very important that when we review these HIB cases, that we basically have in front of us the full investigation summary, and that we've talked about all of the factors in terms of the prongs. Yes. Well, that's a pretty important point, that, you know, that the kid shaved his head and didn't want to come back to school. And if they didn't have evidence of that, then the question is, what was the disruption? Yeah.
Okay, so how are we supposed to know?
Well,
That
well,
every
we
piece of
don't. That's,
information
we have to
that we
rely,
get
we
to
have
us.
to rely on our administration to make sure that
But
that gets reported.
We
And
don't
typically
get,
the hipster program is pretty good. One thing about that is the information that gets put at the hipster does get summarized. But that's an area that we have to be very careful on.
so when we get what we get, it's a summary.
Yes,
That
you get
comes
a
directly
summary.
from Hipster.
And that,
That's the
yeah, that
summary
comes from
report
hipster, but that summary would need to include something like that. That's an important point. In other words, that those factors in the determination are typically relayed to us. And the administration needs to make sure that, you're right, you wouldn't know, because we don't, you know, the board wouldn't know.
We would have no
I
idea.
have no idea. And this board had no idea, you know. Yeah.
I will tell you that from my own personal experience, haircuts are very sensitive topics right now with a lot of teenagers. I constantly experience that. The sensitivity of what feels like a bad haircut is significant.
It's significant.
So actually, speaking of that, so if it comes to light that the board was not presented with all the information, is there like a repercussion for the administration who like didn't provide it all, or how does that?
There
work?
could be, I mean, it's possible. I mean, there could be some, I mean, it's not automatic, but, you know, the board could choose to deal with that in its own fashion. You know, I mean, a lot's going to depend on, you know, what happened and what the facts are. Clappedge versus Fort Lee in 2021. Science teacher appealed the board's decision to affirm results of an HIB investigation. The board concluded that the petitioner committed an act of HIB against a student when he read a confidential email from the student's parents and pupils in another of his classes. Obviously, clearly not a good thing to do. The board affirmed the findings of the investigation and concluded the conduct was based upon a power imbalance. The ALJ concluded that the power imbalance is not a perceived or actual characteristic, nor in the statutes, in the policy or regulations. Therefore, the board failed to establish that there was an act of HIB motivated by an actual or perceived characteristic, and the sustaining of the charges was therefore arbitrary and unreasonable. The commissioner affirmed. So power imbalance is an area, an optional area that we have basically in our policy that is another factor that can be considered in determining whether there's HIB occurring. But in and of itself, it's not enough to find HIB. There always still has to be some perceived or actual characteristic involved, some other distinguishing characteristic. You still need that. Actual characteristic, perceived characteristic, power imbalance itself doesn't get you all the way there. Yeah. Well, that's the way the statute works. You know, you have to have, right. It's an optional prong, but it's not, it doesn't dispose of the need to have some kind of a character. Now, the characteristic, the HIB bullying task force that looked at the statute and made recommendations with respect to it did talk a little bit about this and said that that's an area where you might not have to reach too far to find a distinguishing characteristic. It could be that somebody is being the power imbalance because the individual is actually very attractive and is being, you know, there's jealousy involved, those types of things. But, you know, there needs to be something, some additional characteristic that's there. And it might not be as hard to find in that particular case as in a what we call quote unquote the traditional HIB area. So JB versus Northern Valley Regional. Again, similar case. This is bullied the son because of commitment to academics. No indication to show that the petitioner was a protected class member or any actual or perceived distinguishing characteristic. Petitioner tried to claim that commitment to academics and status as a student were distinguishing characteristics. Judge disagreed. Players were largely universal. This is actually similar to what we talked about before. RC and BC versus Galloway Township Board of Education. alleging the child was a victim of HIB, dismissed by administrative law judge on procedural grounds. This is a case where the parents basically filed without having gone to the board for an appeal. And the commissioner reversed and held that a party challenging the decision does not have to request and participate in a hearing. They can go straight to the commissioner of education. Parent has the right to request a board hearing, but nothing in the statute requires it. However, there is another case that says that basically the parents do not have a right to file an appeal until the board makes its decision. So they can't jump the gun there. They have to wait for the board decision before they file an appeal. AH versus Sayreville, a racially insensitive picture was posted. A student with a mud mask with a caption when he says he's only into black girls. The post was made on a Saturday. The student had many followers, including fellow students at the middle school. It was reported to the administration. It was determined to be HIB. They found the factors were met. And the key issue here was the substantial disruption test for off-campus conduct was satisfied because this is an off-campus social media post. It was not in the school. But here it spilled over into the school. Students were very upset and emotional. There was the potential for altercations. The principal had to monitor the lunch hour for weeks to ensure student safety and to curtail the effects of the students talking about the post throughout the school. So there it was found that that was enough to meet the substantial disruption test for the off-campus conduct. And obviously the other problems were easily met in that case. GC versus Lacey. A complaint was made that comments were made a transgender classmate who was in the boys' bathroom. Girls should not be allowed to use the boys' bathroom. And why is she in here? There's a girls' bathroom. Investigation, the board concluded HIB. The ALJ and the commissioner agreed that there was not anything arbitrary, capricious, or unreasonable in finding HIB. This was reasonably perceived as motivated by the victim's gender identity, clearly a distinguishing characteristic, substantially interfered with the victim's right to use the boys' bathroom and his right to be secure and not fearful. A reasonable person should have known that the comments would have the effect of emotionally harming or that person by making the person feel unsafe or unwelcome. And they had the actual effect of insulting or demeaning the victim and created a hostile educational environment by interfering with the victim's education because the victim was afraid to come out of the bathroom stall after hearing the comment. So. Now we can ask more questions. Done. An excellent question. The questions you've asked so far were all excellent and all very well taken because this is an area where you can debate, as we have oftentimes in closed session, frankly, debated back and forth on particular cases of is it or is it not HIB? And then as we've seen, an ALJ and a law judge may find one way and the commissioner may disagree with that. So there's oftentimes multiple angles to approach these particular cases with.
Are we told if one of our cases goes up to the commissioner or
Yes.
we are?
Yeah,
Okay.
because you would basically, we'll keep the board informed because at that point I'll be typically dealing with an appeal to the commissioner.
Since we do have a couple minutes, can you speak to, you touched on it, I don't remember what it was called, but the group of people that are come together to kind of look at the
School climate
school climate.
safety
Yeah,
committee.
could you talk about that for a minute?
Sure. That's a group that basically it's a team, school safety team. They are charged with, they receive the HIB reports. It includes building staff as well as parents. Parents are not entitled to the confidential information, so they don't get the student information that the rest of the team gets, but parents are part of the group. And the key part of this is they are designed and intended to be the proactive part of the mix, that they basically need to have a handle on the school climate. They need to kind of annually review how the school is doing in terms of addressing HIB, matters of HIB. They look at the HIB incidents. They look at whether there's repeat offenders. They look at whether what the school is doing is sufficient in terms of addressing it. They also can weigh in on to some extent on the training that's basically being provided. So that's a very important key component in terms of the the proactive part of the statute in terms of dealing with school climate, because a key part of the statute is school climate. That's the key goal. The goal is to prevent this from happening, and we're never going to stop it. But it's to try to minimize it as much as possible by not reacting, but essentially being proactive to try to address the issues.
Can I ask a question on the
Sure.
school climate? Is that one that we have for the district? Is there one per school? Does
Each school
each
has
school
its
has
own.
it? And then do they have to, or do they report back to the board in any way about what their results are?
They typically don't report individually to the board, but through the superintendent, through annual reporting, there should be a kind of a summary. It should be part of the information that the board gets in terms of its annual review of the policy. In terms of that, that's how we get some of the feedback. So it's relayed through the superintendent, basically. Good question.
So that's probably something that would come through P&L. Jen. Thanks.
Sounds good.
Yeah, no, yeah, thank you. It's helpful. Interesting questions.
Yeah.
Ben?
In addition to Mallory's law, what other statutes are kind of the basis of the HIB laws? Are there other?
Well, the HIB law itself is it's at NJSA 18A37 dash. Now I don't want to give you the number offhand because I may not get it right, but it's in chapter 37 of Title 18A, which is the Anti-Bullying Bill of Rights. There are other statutes that exist. There's an anti-hazing statute. There's a variety of statutes that kind of have additional interplays, but the HIB statute itself is a discrete law. And there's a regulation that also implements it in Title 6A.
Would you mind providing us with like a reference to the law so that we could more easily look it up? That would be
Sure,
great.
I can give it to you. I had my book here, I could open it up, but I right. And I think the reg is 6A:16A dash 7 point.
Wow.
Right, yeah, right. I don't want to put it,
Believe you, Paul. We
Right.
would believe you no matter what.
I can
number
tell you it's in 6A:16-7 somewhere. Right.
Other questions, comments from anybody, any other board members?
Well, thank you. You're very attentive and very rapt audience. Ask good questions.
Well, this is a major pain point for the board. It's a major pain point for our students and the staff, and it's a pain point for the board when we wrestle with these,
I know.
week after, meeting after meeting. It's a lot to think about, and it's a lot of responsibility. And I think, very unfortunately, if any of us are watching the news, which a lot of us do, we see very upsetting situations in schools that have these situations go on and where they can lead to. So it's very important.
The Anti-Bullying Bull Act begins at New Jersey Statute 18A:37-13.2.
Every now and then I like to look at the statutes and see if I can understand any of the legalese, but like one of my biggest problems with so many different like rules and regulations, whether, we're talking, HIB or fair funding or other things that we deal with, is that like what the rules are is often very distant from what we know. Like nobody goes and says, well, the statute says, and you recite 100 pages of code, like, and if you did, nobody would understand what you're saying. Like, so it's I like to try to get to the root of understanding of, why the HIB law, like, what does it do? Like,
Right.
because we can discuss and, at different times, like, what does the HIB law even do? Like, at the end of the day, we're just reporting numbers, and there doesn't seem to be much teeth beyond what's in the code of conduct. And that's where the real disciplinary part is, so I, for me, I'd be interested, whether I have time to actually look this up, I don't know, but it is nice to know where the information is, so that if I had time to look at it, I could try to get a deeper, broader understanding of why.
Right. And here's the regulation site. It's 6A:16 dash 7.7. Yes, 7.7. And you can find that on the department head's website. The one thing I will say is, if you read our policy, the HIB policy, you will find most of what's in the statute and regulations are in that policy. So that policy really is very comprehensive
And long.
and long.
It's very long.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
In fact, really, if you read that policy, I don't think there's going to be much else you'll find in the statute or regs.
So gives us lots of food for thought. Thank you so much for a very comprehensive
Thank you.
presentation. I think we continue to have the kind of the application conversations. How do we apply this? How do we help the families understand how it's applied? Because I think that's where kind of sometimes the greatest challenge is. And interestingly too, just addition, Mallory's law requires districts to track repeat offenders, especially if it's 3 offenses. But one of my questions is, what about repeat victims? Because they often have, there's something going on that is, putting them at the center of these situations at times for a variety of reasons. And we want to keep, I think, a close eye on those kids just as much
Yeah,
as we keep it.
My
kids who are
experience is
doing
that the administrations are very sensitive to that. They're very aware of.
who those
repeat,
kids
yeah.
are. Yeah. I just think it's, side note, I think this is tough because not tough. There are so, I reference this a lot, but being around a lot of teenagers, the language and the things that are said and the jokes and the, with adults, with kids, it's just a constant, part of, there's a developmental piece that plays into this at every age that I think it makes it so challenging.
Yeah,
And yet it's so
absolutely.
important.
As Dr. Malash says, age appropriate, inappropriate behavior.
It's a very good saying. Right.
Okay, there we go. Sorry. I just wanted to say thank you, Paul, for this training. I think it reiterates for me every single year having this, how important it is as us for board members to remove a large part of what we might think when we're looking at the statute and reviewing these cases over and over and over again, because what we might interpret as one thing is not as clear cut to say what it is, according to this messy statute.
Right.
So I appreciate you really trying to make it as clear as mud every single time. So,
We try.
thanks.
It's a tough job.
Thank you. Any further? Okay, could I have a motion to adjourn? As I have a second for a motion to adjourn? Okay, Mrs. Tong, all in favor? Aye. Thank you. Adjourn. Motion carries.
You're like right on 7:30.
Right.
Close. I said that.